Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting from the world of international tax law. I know, it's not exactly a day at the beach, but this one's got a pretty interesting twist involving a company that I think everyone will recognize, Nestle.
Yeah, it's a case of some unintended consequences that really could have some pretty big effects on how countries deal with these tax treaties in the future.
So what happened?
Well, Switzerland just kind of dropped a bombshell. They are hitting pause on a really key part of their tax treaty with India, a clause that you might have heard of before. It's called Most Favored Nation, or MFN for short.
Okay.
And this all goes back to a ruling by the Indian Supreme Court that really kind of flipped the script on how we think about these MFN clauses, especially when it comes to countries that are in the OECD, that big group of mostly developed countries.
Okay, so before we get too deep into this whole thing with the international organizations and all that stuff, let's just break it down a little bit. What does this most favored nation clause actually do? Like I'm picturing, kings and queens exchanging gifts.
Not quite. Think of it more like a loyalty program, but for countries. So if Switzerland signs a tax treaty with India, and they promise a 10% tax rate on something, but later on they give a better deal to, say, France at 5%, that MFN clause is going to kick in, and it basically says, hey, India gets that 5% rate too, because they're a most favored nation.
Ah, so it's all about making sure everyone's getting the best deal, no special treatment.
Exactly. It prevents discrimination, and it encourages countries to just offer their most favorable terms right up front because they know they can't play favorites later.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does Nestle fit into all of this, and what does this have to do with the OECD?
So India had these older tax treaties with Colombia and Lithuania that offered lower tax rates than their agreements with OECD members. Then both of those countries, they went and joined the OECD, which really kind of complicated things a little bit.
Yeah, I bet it did. So Switzerland probably thought, hey, we're entitled to those lower rates too, thanks to that MFN clause.
Exactly. They argued because India was giving better rates to Colombia and Lithuania, who were now OECD members. The MFN clause should apply to Switzerland. But the Indian Supreme Court said, not so fast.
Hold on, so this really all comes down to just how you interpret that most favored nation clause.
Yeah.
Did the Supreme Court say it doesn't apply to countries that join the OECD after a treaty's already been signed?
You got it. They ruled that the NFN clause wasn't automatically triggered just because a country joined the OECD, especially when India already had those tax treaties in place before they even became members.
Wow, that's a real curveball. So Switzerland basically said, fine, if we're not getting the same perks as everyone else, we're taking our MFN ball and going home.
Pretty much. They're suspending that part of the treaty starting January 1, 2025.
2025. So there's still some time for Indian companies operating in Switzerland to adjust.
Yes, but they need to act fast. One of the biggest impacts of this is going to be on dividend income. Right now, the withholding tax on those dividends is a nice, comfortable 5%. But come 2025, that rate's going to jump all the way up to 10%.
Ouch, that's double the tax. And I remember reading somewhere that this could affect a lot of investment money.
Absolutely. We could be talking about impacting over $100 billion in investment commitments under the European Free Trade Agreement. This isn't just some small tax tweak.
This is huge. We're talking serious money and potential shockwaves.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean? What are the real-world consequences here?
Well, imagine like a line of dominoes. That first domino falling is that Supreme Court ruling in India. And now suddenly other countries that have signed these treaties with India that also have this most favored nation clause are kind of looking around nervously.
Oh, so you're saying that if Switzerland can successfully challenge how India uses the MFN clause, other countries might think, hey, we can do that too.
Exactly. So we could be seeing a whole bunch of countries suddenly reviewing their own tax treaties with India and maybe even renegotiating the terms. And this domino effect could go even further than just India. It could even change how MFN clauses are used and interpreted in tax treaties all around the world.
Wow, so this isn't just some isolated thing. This could be a global chain reaction.
That's exactly what makes this whole case so fascinating. It raises these questions about, fairness and reciprocity in international agreements.
This really shows just how important the OECD has become in setting those global tax standards. It's like the cool kids club, and if you're not a member, you might not get invited to the best parties.
That's a pretty good analogy. The OECD does play a big role in shaping these international tax policies. And this case could be a wake-up call for countries that aren't members to start thinking about what they might be missing out on when it comes to negotiating those tax treaties.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture here, but let's zoom in a little bit. What does this mean for our listeners? What are the practical takeaways here?
Well, the first one is really simple. Don't take your tax treaties for granted. They're not set in stone. And, as we've seen here, unexpected things can happen and trigger some really big changes.
So it's like they say the only thing that's constant is change. Except in this case, that change might mean a bigger tax bill.
Exactly. The second takeaway is this. If you're a business that's operating in multiple countries, especially in places like India that have these complex tax laws, you really need to understand the treaties that are in place and stay informed about anything that could affect them.
So don't just bury your head in the sand and hope for the best.
Definitely not. And the third takeaway is make sure you have someone you can turn to for advice. International tax law is really complicated, and trying to figure it out on your own is a recipe for disaster.
So find a good guide, someone who can help you navigate these treacherous mountain passes of international finance.
Exactly. A good tax advisor can help you understand all the little details of these treaties and help you get ahead of any potential challenges, and hopefully minimize how much you end up having to pay in taxes.
That's good advice, even for someone like me who still gets confused filling out their own tax forms.
It's complicated stuff, but that's why we're here to break it down. Now, before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one final thought, a real head-scratcher. We've been talking a lot about this Swiss-Indian situation, but what if this case is just the tip of the iceberg?
Ooh, now you got me interested. What do you mean?
Well, think about it. All these issues, we've been talking about how MFN clauses are interpreted, the role of the OECD, the whole idea of reciprocity. Those are all relevant to any country that has tax treaties, not just Switzerland and India.
So you're saying this could be a wake-up call for governments and businesses all over the world to take a closer look at their tax treaties?
Exactly. And it could even lead to a whole bunch of countries reviewing and renegotiating their treaties just to make sure they're getting a fair deal.
It's amazing and a little scary to think how one court case could completely reshape how international taxes work.
It really shows how connected our world is. Something that happens in one part of the world can have a big impact on the other side.
This whole deep dive has been fascinating. We started with Switzerland and India and ended up talking about the future of global business and the need for companies to be proactive, adaptable, and informed.
It goes to show you that in today's world, even something that seems small can have really big consequences. And understanding those complexities is crucial for success.
So there you have it, everyone. A whirlwind tour through international tax law, courtesy of Switzerland, India, and a little help from Nestle.
We hope you learned something valuable from this deep dive. And remember, the only thing that's certain in international taxation is that there's no certainty.
That's a great point to end on. Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay informed.
Okay, so we've really gone through a lot with this Swiss-Indian tax treaty story. And we've seen how, one legal case can turn into this big global thing, potentially changing how businesses and countries work together all over the place.
It really does. It just goes to show how everything's connected in the global economy. Like one court decision can send these ripples across continents.
Exactly. So as we move into this new era of international tax law, I'm kind of curious, what's the big takeaway for all those companies out there that are doing business globally? What should they be thinking about right now?
Well, the key thing is don't just react. You got to anticipate. The world of international tax, it's always changing. So instead of waiting for the next curveball to come along, companies really need to be looking ahead and figure out where they're exposed and where they're vulnerable.
So basically, they need to be thinking, what if this happens to us? What if our own tax treaty gets re-examined? You got it. It's all about asking those what-if questions, doing some serious risk assessments, and having a plan ready to go just in case things go south.
I imagine this goes beyond just having a good tax advisor on speed dial.
For sure. It's about building a culture of awareness within the entire company. Everyone that's involved in international operations, from finance to legal, even marketing and sales, they all need to understand how these changing tax laws could affect them.
So you're saying knowledge is power when it comes to this whole complicated world of international taxes.
Absolutely. Especially because things are changing so fast, the companies that stay ahead of the game are going to be the ones that succeed.
You know, this whole deep dive has been eye-opening. We started with Switzerland and India, and we ended up talking about the future of global business and how important it is for companies to be adaptable and stay informed.
It just goes to show you, even something that seems isolated can have huge consequences. And understanding all this is really key if you want to make it in the global marketplace.
So that's it for today, everyone. A wild ride through the world of international tax law.
Yeah.
Big thanks to Switzerland, India, and of course Nestle for helping us out.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive and learned something new. And always remember, the only thing for sure in international taxation is that nothing's for sure.
That's a perfect way to end things. Until next time, keep those minds curious and stay informed.